It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, live from Jerusalem after the deadliest single attack of the Israel-Hamas war. A hospital is hit in Gaza, leaving as many as 800 people dead. Hamas calls it a massacre. Israel says a militant Palestinian group is to blame. Palestinians protest in the West Bank, condemnation in the Arab world and beyond, all as President Joe Biden prepares to fly into the region. And still no ground invasion from Israel's military, as its commander suggests the war may now take a different tack. Plus, the Islamist terror on the streets of Brussels as we hear a warning from the head of MI5 of the growing risk of violence in the UK.
My teams are absolutely alert to the possibility that events in the Middle East cause some people in the United Kingdom to attempt some form of attack of whatever sort.
Booing at Wembley as England's players and fans are asked to fall silent to remember the victims in Brussels amid a highly visible police presence. And one family, so many victims. We hear how one British Palestinian woman is coping with her loss. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages for you. That's coming up in our press preview from 10:30. Hello, good evening. Live from Jerusalem. President Biden is expected here tomorrow, and he will fly into the aftermath of the deadliest attack on Gaza in at least 15 years. At least 500 people, potentially up to 800, are feared dead after the bombardment of a hospital in Gaza City. Hamas called it a horrific massacre. Israel said a Palestinian group, Islamic Jihad, was to blame. While Israel is continuing to attack from the air, Gaza still awaits a ground invasion, though the Israeli Defense Forces suggested today that could change. Well, tonight's bloodshed came after more than 600,000 people fled northern Gaza seeking safety. Many made their way south down the main highway. Some sought shelter in schools run by the United Nations. At least 6 people were killed this afternoon after an airstrike on one such shelter in Al-Maghazi. And then tonight, there was the attack on the Ahli al Arabi hospital in Gaza City. Our international correspondent, John Sparks, has our first report, a warning. It contains images of the injuries suffered in the attack and some of the dead.
No one expects an attack on a hospital, but it seems hundreds have been killed in a brutal assault. The facility in Gaza City is called the Ahli al Arabi, which is run by the Anglican Church, and much of it has been destroyed. Gaza's Health Ministry has blamed the Israelis, calling it an act of genocide. The Israelis have blamed a rocket fired by militant group Islamic Jihad. Many of the hospital's occupants, both patients and displaced residents, were readmitted to Gaza's largest medical facility called Al-Shifa. And its emergency room was quickly overwhelmed, some waiting in the hospital corridors. Others were left on the floor. Mohim, are you awake? Says a medic. Yes, he replies. Cover him, cover him. It is the deadliest single attack in Gaza for many years, and it has attracted worldwide condemnation from governments and international aid agencies. The diplomats have been talking about safe zones and assistance, while Israel hammers Gaza with airstrikes. These images taken in the city of Deir al-Balah. It's in a section of the Strip where civilians were instructed to seek shelter. Yet hundreds have been killed here in the past 24 hours. Nearby, in the city of Khan Yunis, a boy called Kinan is brought to the front door of the hospital. His body has been pulled from the rubble, and a doctor looks for signs of life. But the 7-year-old is dead. Finished, says the medic. The boy is carried to the back of the hospital. So young, says this orderly. Have mercy upon us. A woman cries as he's brought into a compound where the bodies are prepared for burial. The majority here consumed with grief. Their loved ones wrapped in sheets, some blood-soaked, and laid in rows.
God will take revenge on you, Israel, and hell to the Arabs, hell to those who watch and do nothing. I hope your blood wasn't shed for nothing.
Our team watched as dozens of bodies were brought into the hospital. The victims of at least 4 separate airstrikes on Khan Yunis, this city of refuge enveloped by the war. Ambulance after ambulance have pulled into Al-Shifa, unloading the survivors and unloading the dead. Bodies now fill much of the hospital's forecourt, with the number of casualties expected to rise. There are no safe zones in the Gaza Strip. There is nowhere left to hide, it seems, as a crisis turns into a catastrophe. John Sparks, Sky News.
The bloodshed in Gaza has had an immediate impact tonight in the West Bank, not far from here in Jerusalem. Hundreds of protesters took to the streets of Ramallah. Large crowds gathered in the city centre before clashing with security forces. Protesters targeted a police vehicle but were eventually dispersed. Well, the former Hamas chief, Khaled Mishal, had called on supporters to immediately stage protests following today's attacks in Gaza. Well, our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle joins me now. And a day of rage called for tomorrow, the day that Joe Biden's supposed to arrive. But what about the anger that we've seen so far after what's happened in Gaza?
I think tonight's events have released some anger that has been bottled up by Palestinians in the West Bank and around the Arab world. We've seen protests tonight, not just in Ramallah, which is normally a pretty peaceful city. It has instances, but is normally pretty stable. Hebron to Bethlehem, Nablus, Jenin. It's to be seen whether or not this was something that lasted a few hours or whether it's something that is the start of something bigger. The Israelis have come out with their response tonight saying that they believe it was a rocket fired by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which, just to remind, is the smaller of the militant groups in Gaza. They haven't released any proof of that yet, but that is their statement. Regardless of what the IDF say, there'll be people around the Arab world who just won't believe them. Many of the Palestinian people will not hear what the IDF have to say, and they will not believe it anyway. And that is why right now is a very dangerous time. Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, who is due to meet Joe Biden tomorrow in Amman, has cancelled that meeting. That would have been a very important meeting for the two to have had. King Abdullah, who is hosting that meeting as the King of Jordan, has described this tonight as a crime against humanity. So it is an awkward moment, given the diplomacy, but it is a dangerous moment in this conflict.
Alistair, thank you. Well, thousands of Palestinians are trying to escape the bombardment in Gaza across the one border not controlled by Israel. Their problem is that the country that holds the key, Egypt, also won't let them through. It also means much-needed aid is unable to enter Gaza. Well, the crossing is at Rafah, at the southern tip of the Gaza Strip, which is closed, Egypt says, because of Israeli airstrikes. Our Africa correspondent, Yusra El-Bakhir, has this report now from Cairo.
Hundreds of metric tons of humanitarian aid waiting to be delivered to Gaza from Egypt. And on the other side of the Rafah border crossing, Hundreds of Palestinians are waiting to leave.
The situation is threatening my life and everybody's life, you know. You can't be safe here.
The areas they fled from Israeli airstrikes burn in the distance. But even here at the crossing, the aerial attacks come too. It's Gaza's only border point that isn't controlled by Israel. And yet, without Israel's agreement, the crossing is not safe to open. As the days of build-up continue, diplomats have been flying in and out of Cairo to cement a corridor. The supplies that have passed through Egypt to Rafah are the only hope that residents of Gaza have to face the shortages from the ongoing siege from Israel. Medicine, food, and water. Essentials that civilians in Gaza are currently facing war without. And though these supplies are yet to reach them, planes of aid keep landing in Egypt.
We have received 12 planes with medical supplies, and the trucks have gone towards the crossing today. We hope that the crossing will open today or tomorrow at the latest.
We are at the Rafah border crossing, says Ali, a coordinator. And we have with us all the aid that will be sufficient for a long time for our people in Gaza. On the other side, Gazans are facing an onslaught of deadly Israeli airstrikes. And as the number of casualties rises, so too does the desperation for these supplies. But another day of diplomacy has passed, and the green light is yet to come. Yusra al-Baghir, Sky News, Cairo.
Well, we focused so far tonight on the suffering inside Gaza, but there was an emotional reminder of the ongoing pain for Israelis today. The mother of a 21-year-old hostage shown in a Hamas video last night told Sky News that when she saw it, she saw her baby in pain and afraid. She was speaking as diplomatic efforts continued to free the hostages and contain the war. Our security and defence editor Deborah Haynes reports now from Israel.
Israeli ground troops near the border with Gaza, keeping their distance for now. But this war with Hamas is already approaching a moment of maximum peril as the civilian death toll from Israel's aerial bombardments grows. World leaders are mobilizing. Germany's Chancellor with the Prime Minister in a show of support and also a sign of concern that Iran may seek to exploit the crisis.
Ausdrücklich warne ich, kein Akteur.
Explicitly, I warn, no actor should think it is a good idea to intervene now in this conflict from the outside. It would be a grave and unforgivable mistake.
The US is sending an even blunter warning with more warships bound for the region. Joe Biden also soon to be en route, and possibly Britain's Prime Minister. But Iran, a sponsor of Hamas, is also testing its influence when it comes to Gaza.
If this crime continues, Muslims and resistance forces will be impatient, and nobody will be able to stop them.
The high stakes are likely why Israel's ground forces are in more of a holding pattern than a rush to advance. What is changing is things like the diplomacy with the US president due to arrive here soon. There's also growing concern about the mounting humanitarian crisis in Gaza and alarm about the potential for the conflict here to ignite a regional war. Another major complication is the fate of at least 199 hostages, including babies, taken from Israel into Gaza by Hamas militants during their October the 7th attack. One mother spoke of the relief she felt at seeing a hostage video showing her daughter was alive, followed by a feeling of pain only a parent could understand.
And I looked at this film, I just wanted to die because I saw my baby, that she's hurt and that she's in pain, that she suffers, and that she's very, very afraid, and that she's alone. I saw it in her eyes. I saw her like she's 2 years old. I saw this baby crying for her mother. Yeah, it was terrible, really. It is terrible.
And it could be about to get even worse. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Southern Israel.
So that then is the backdrop to one of the most consequential trips that President Biden may ever make. He's due to leave Washington shortly, and our US correspondent Martha Kellner is at the White House for us tonight, and that backdrop could not be worse, Martha.
Yeah, it seems almost crass to say, given the bloodshed in Israel and Gaza, but this really is terrible, terrible timing for President Biden. He remains this afternoon inside the White House, undergoing final preparations with his closest aides to what was already a remarkable wartime trip to Israel and the Middle East. But the complexion of that visit has completely shifted in the past 3 hours since we've seen what's been unfolding at that hospital in Gaza. We've had no official communication from President Biden, but certainly no suggestion that his trip will be delayed, let alone cancelled. You imagine there's been an awful large fact-finding mission inside the White House to try and establish what exactly happened at that hospital and who is responsible. The US have a big intelligence presence in the region. President Biden also has a very close relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. And it is Netanyahu who President Biden is expected to meet, first of all, in Tel Aviv tomorrow. He was then expected to take a trip to Amman in Jordan to a summit being hosted by King Abdullah alongside the Egyptian President El-Sisi and the President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. But a close official of Mahmoud Abbas says he won't now attend that meeting. And I think that gives you some idea of just how much sentiment in the region has shifted in the past few hours as a result of what's happened in the hospital in Gaza. But we are still expecting President Biden to attend what will be a hugely consequential meeting with Netanyahu and possibly other regional leaders as well.
Well, certainly looks like there's some movement there at the White House. Martha, we will, of course, return to you if we see Joe Biden. Now, an apparent Islamist-inspired gunman was shot dead in Brussels today. He was the suspect in the killing of 2 Swedish football fans in the city last night. Following the attack, a man claiming to be the killer appeared in a video on social media in which he said he was a member of Islamic State. From Brussels, our Europe correspondent Adam Parsons has this report.
It started with a scene of horror. Abdusalam El, unmissable in his orange jacket, shooting dead 2 Swedish football fans. He then went outside, tended to his rifle and escaped into the night. He left behind 2 video messages, which quickly appeared over social media channels. One in which he pledges allegiance to Islamic State, and then a later one where he admits the murders and says he targeted people from Sweden. The hunt for him paralysed Brussels, an international football match abandoned, and the killer revealed to be a failed asylum seeker. And then, suddenly, the end. Abdusalam El cornered in a cafe near his home and shot by police. He had first been spotted on a bus. We spoke to one of the passengers.
I was in the bus, and the man was at the front. The bus driver saw him and called for support. And he had a weapon in his bag. I was scared. He could have shot me.
The terrorist was taken to hospital, soon dying of his injuries. In the space of less than 13 hours, Abdusalam El had killed 2 people, gone on the run, caused the threat level in this city to be raised to its highest point, and had then himself in turn been shot and killed just down the road from where I'm standing. It was a brief period of time, but for Brussels, it was the cause of terrible anxiety. So what did provoke these killings? One theory is that it was fury at Sweden for allowing a Quran to be burnt publicly.
It seems that in one of the communications he made, it was indicated that burning the Quran was a red line that should not be crossed.
There's no proven connection between these killings and the conflict in the Middle East, but this was the second terror attack in Europe in a few days, following the murder of a teacher in northern France.
Abdeslam was caught and shot inside this cafe. One man responsible for causing so much pain and so much fear. Adam Parsons, Sky News, Brussels.
There is no link indicated between the Brussels shooting and the Israel-Hamas war, prosecutors in Belgium said today. But there is a warning tonight from one of the UK's top security officials that events in the Middle East could lead to an attempted attack at home. The head of MI5 was speaking to our US correspondent Mark Stone, who is in San Francisco tonight. And Mark, a clear concern then from a senior intelligence official.
Yes, a very rare public statement by the Director General of MI5. And it is clear tonight, I think, that security officials, not just in the UK, but around the Western world, are very, very concerned about just how events in the Middle East echo around the world and how they potentially really do complicate the domestic security landscape in countries, in Western nations around the world. Have a listen to a bit of what he said.
So sadly, over the course of my career, it has often been the case that events in the Middle East can then echo in Europe, in the UK. And so my teams are absolutely alert to the possibility that events in the Middle East cause some people in the United Kingdom to attempt some form of attack of whatever sort. That is not a new phenomenon, but clearly at a time like this, we are focused with particular intensity on the possibility of risks materialising. But yes, naturally, the events of the last 2 weeks have sharpened that concern still further.
Now, Ken McCallum is here in Silicon Valley for a meeting that was due to be about artificial intelligence, but it has been overshadowed by events in the Middle East. I was speaking also to the director of the FBI, who echoed those concerns. They are very, very attuned to the fact that there could be a rise in lone wolf attacks or indeed coordinated attacks by known terrorist groups, either anti-Semitic groups, anti-Islamophobic groups, others too. So they are very, very concerned tonight.
Mark Stone, live for us there in San Francisco. Thank you. Now, the Metropolitan Police said they would deploy a highly visible police presence at the England-Italy international match tonight. Well, a minute's silence was held for the victims of the Brussels attacks before the match kicked off, though it was marred by some booing. Let's bring in our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt. And what sort of security presence was there outside Wembley tonight then, Martin?
Well, the Metropolitan Police had promised a high visibility policing. Now, from where we were standing in front of the stadium, there were little pockets of police officers scattered around as the crowds approached over, an hour and a half before the kickoff. I didn't detect that there was any huge amount of police officers, and certainly when I walked around the back streets, there was none of the usual van loads of reinforcements. This was really all about reassurance. I think quite clearly the shadow of the Brussels shooting last night hung over this game. And although there didn't appear to be any suggestion that anything like that was expected to happen here, I think inevitably fans coming to this game would have been dwelling on the events of last night. I mean, the Brussels gunmen clearly used the platform of the game in Brussels to launch that murderous attack against football supporters. And if anybody wasn't thinking of that, then the minute silence just before the kickoff would have brought it home to them. There was booing, so in terms of controversy, that probably was about it. But Scotland Yard say no incidents of any note outside the ground.
Martin, live there for us at Wembley. Thank you. Well, we will have more from Jerusalem, possibly movement too at the White House. But for now, let's head back to Neil for more of the day's news.
Anna, thanks very much. We turn our attention to politics. And you'd certainly not describe it as the easiest introduction for a new party leader. The SNP's Humza Yousaf has seen the arrest of his predecessor, financial problems for his party and a massive by-election defeat. Well, today, his message to his party was that they needed to roll up their sleeves. Our Scotland correspondent Conor Gillis reports from Aberdeen.
The new man in the SNP show, centre stage in a year of drama, where the party has been the uncomfortable protagonist.
We can either spend time feeling sorry for ourselves, or we can take another course of action. Let me tell you what that is. We roll up our sleeves, we work harder than ever before for the people of Scotland.
And with that came news of a council tax freeze. All the while, an audience of hardcore supporters reminded that plans to use the next general election as an independence vote have been ditched.
Around half of our fellow Scots already support independence. And I have no doubt that we can turn that half into a sustained majority. And we will do so when we concentrate not on the how, but on the why.
The stakes were high for this speech, stepping out from behind the shadow of Nicola Sturgeon. But after 16 years in government and fresh from a hammering in a recent by-election, Humza Yousaf knows fine well that the SNP's stranglehold on Scottish politics is being tested, and Labour is the new threat.
I'm sure there are many people who think we've had it too easy for too long, but this stuff should never be easy. Has the country changed? Yes, of course it has. The country has changed, the economy has changed, society has changed, post-pandemic, war in Europe, all of these things. So what matters more than getting a strategy for independence is a case for independence.
Away from the SNP bubble, is the political sand shifting in Aberdeen?
A few of my friends do politics at uni, but I say that they would probably vote for SNP, but I don't think that they would vote for independence, no.
At the moment, we're worse off with the SNP in Edinburgh, aren't we? Paying more tax than the rest of the country.
Most people who are keen on independence, they're not in any rush to make it happen just for the sake of it.
This was an SNP gathering during its most painful period in history. It does remain the biggest political force in Scotland, but there has been a sense of fear that could be waning after so long. Conor Gillis, Sky News, Aberdeen.
A lawyer for the family of Captain Sir Tom Moore has said that the foundation set up in his name will be closed down following an investigation by the Charity Commission. The admission was made at an appeal hearing to decide whether a spa at the home of Captain Tom's daughter and her husband should be demolished after being built without planning permission. The foundation, set up in June 2020 following Captain Tom's fundraising efforts during the pandemic, is currently being investigated by the Charity Commission. The Department of Health will hold talks with the British Medical Association after the union agreed to pause consultant doctor strikes in the hope of finding a resolution to that long-running dispute over pay and pensions. Earlier, the NHS Chief Executive, Amanda Pritchard, had urged the BMA to meet with ministers after revealing doctors had been on strike for the equivalent of a whole month so far this year. And we saw the run-up to England's international game just a little earlier. England have booked their place in next summer's European Championships. Gareth Southgate's side beating Italy 3-1 at Wembley. Captain Harry Kane scoring twice.
Well, let's just bring you some breaking news concerning Joe Biden's visit to Israel and Jordan. We're just hearing from King Abdullah of Jordan that a planned summit in the capital, Amman, has now been cancelled. It had been a four-way summit. Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, the Egyptian President al-Sisi, King Abdullah and Joe Biden. Mahmoud Abbas had already pulled out, and King Abdullah tonight had called the bombing in Gaza a crime on humanity. That part of the visit has certainly been cancelled. At the moment, it would appear that Joe Biden is still intending to leave the US on his way. There is Air Force One standing by at Andrews Air Force Base. We're anticipating Joe Biden will depart. We have not heard anything to the contrary. The plan then would be that he arrives in Tel Aviv in the morning for meetings with Benjamin Netanyahu. We stand by for more on that. Well, we began Sky News at 10 tonight with the devastation of the attack on the Ahli al Arabi hospital in Gaza. We end tonight with the grief of one family who have lost many members since the war between Hamas and Israel began. Wafa Shamalak has watched in horror from the UK as 16 relatives and an estimated 60 family friends in the Israeli bombardment in Gaza. She spoke to Sky's Sajid Chowdhury.
I can't imagine them under the rebels. I can't imagine them dead. I can't imagine that I'm not going to see them when I go back home to Gaza.
Wafa Shamallah is mourning the death of 16 relatives. They were all killed in the last week by Israel's bombing of Gaza. This is what's left of the house belonging to Wafa's uncle Abdel Nasser. An airstrike killed everyone inside. Abdel Nasser, his wife, their 5 sons, their daughter-in-law, and 2 grandchildren all died. 3 generations of an entire family killed in one strike. A gruesome reality for those left behind.
They found Muhammad's body. He was the first to found. And then Ahmad. The rest of the family. My uncle. And his Asad. Marwan. They couldn't find Marwan's body. All of them were under the rubbles.
For people like Wafa with family in Gaza, this sort of grief is depressingly familiar.
I lost family members in 2012, 2008. Every war we lose loved ones. It's not only this time, but this time was the most. It was the hardest one.
Abdel Nasser's home will now stand just as a memory on video. His family farm with its grapes and figs left without its owners, their horses devoid of riders. The youngest of the victims was Omar, just 2 months old. He never really got to know this world, nor meet some of his grieving family left behind. Sadia Chowdhury, Sky News.
Well, more reaction tonight. The Foreign Secretary James Cleverly has just posted on social media the UK government's response to the civilian deaths in Gaza, saying the destruction of Ahli Hospital is a devastating loss of human life. The UK has been clear the protection of civilian life must come first. The UK will work with our allies to find out what has happened and protect innocent civilians in Gaza. Rishi Sunak, of course, planning his own visit this week to Israel. Our coverage, of course, on that continues. For now, let's head back to Neil.
Anna, thanks very much indeed. That indeed was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we will, of course, be taking a first look at the papers in the press preview. Tonight, we're joined by the broadcaster and commentator Ali Miraj and the Observer's chief leader writer Sonia Soda. Amongst the stories we'll be discussing, you will not be surprised that this is going to feature pretty heavily. Here is the eye. Well, in fact, it's not. It is the Financial Times. Their headline there, Gaza Health Ministry says hundreds killed in an Israeli airstrike on the hospital. Of course, Israel now denying that. Stay right where you are. We'll be taking you through all the papers after this. You're watching Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. But first, our top stories this hour. And hundreds of people have been killed in an attack on the Ahli al Arabi hospital in Gaza, with both sides blaming the other for the atrocity. Breaking news in just the last few minutes. The leaders of both Jordan and Palestine have pulled out a proposed summit with the US President Joe Biden, who is due to arrive in Israel in the morning. Well, currently, Air Force One is sitting on the tarmac. As mentioned, those hundreds of deaths at a hospital in Gaza have complicated one of the most complicated situations that I've ever had to report on. It is uncertain just yet as to what exactly Joe Biden will be doing. He will, in fact, it looks like he may well be arriving just now as we look at these pictures. Indeed, yeah, that is the convoy heading straight for Air Force One. So the plane will be wheels up at some point today. Joe Biden will be, we assume, heading to Israel. But that trip to Jordan, it appears, won't now be happening. Let's speak to our US correspondent, Martha Kellner, joining us from Washington. I mean, Martha, you were saying this earlier whilst talking to Anna Jones, that it feels like a horrible, horrible thing to have to say. But what has happened at that hospital in Gaza has cast an almighty pall over the diplomatic efforts which Joe Biden wished to insert himself right into the middle of, the efforts that people would be hoping would be leading to a reduction in the violence, if not a complete cessation.
Yeah, it's crass to say, Neil, but this timing couldn't be worse for President Biden. The complexion of this trip to Israel and the Middle East has completely shifted in the past 3 hours since that blast at the hospital in Gaza. We can see here the motorcade arriving at Joint Base Andrews, I believe, carrying President Biden. He left the White House here where I am around 20 minutes ago, so just a short journey there. But even in the space of that journey, this trip has shifted even more. He was expecting tomorrow to fly in to Tel Aviv to meet, first of all, with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. He was then expecting, up until about 20 minutes ago, to travel from Tel Aviv to Amman in Jordan to a summit to be hosted by King Abdullah of Jordan, which would be attended by the Egyptian President el-Sisi and also the President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. Well, a few hours ago, Mahmoud Abbas said, no, I won't be there. I want no part of it. In the past few minutes, we're hearing that summit in Jordan has now been completely cancelled. So one half of President Biden's trip to Israel and the Middle East no longer exists. And it was a very, very important half of his trip because it was there that he was going to appeal to those leaders to try and get behind Israel, as the US has, to try and get them to commit their full support to Israel, and also to try and stave off a widening of this conflict, to try and prevent this conflict from mushrooming further, which of course is the very real fear that groups like Iran-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon will get involved, which will make this an altogether even more serious situation. He now won't get the ability to do that in person. He won't have that meeting with those three senior leaders in the region. That won't be happening now. So there'll be some major recalibration happening with President Biden and his closest aides as he prepares to get onto that Air Force One plane bound for Tel Aviv.
Very much indeed. Well, we're going to stay with these pictures, of course. Joe Biden expected to leave very, very shortly, but still with us in the studio, and we hope we'll fully be turning our attention to the papers in just a second. The broadcaster and commentator Ali Maraj, the Observer's chief leader writer Sonia Soda. This indeed, there is Joe Biden approaching the plane. I mean, Ali, this makes the trip that President Biden had wished to take that much more complicated. And goodness, even in our discussion, we haven't yet got on to the rather tricky, the rather thorny issue of actually who was responsible for this.
Well, I mean, it could not be worse timing for Joe Biden, who was going into a diplomatic storm in any case. It's absolutely horrendous what's happened this evening with this hospital being targeted. Now, Israel has denied it's them. You hear the Palestinian side saying it is definitely Israel. And Israel is saying it's Islamic Jihad, or it could be a misfired rocket from Hamas. irrespective of who is to blame for this, there are innocent civilians who are dying here. The UN is saying that this is the worst humanitarian catastrophe in its 50 years since it's been in Gaza. There's a blockade going on. There are people even dying in the south in attacks as well. And the danger here for Israel is that there was a huge understandable amount of sympathy for Israel following that horrendous attack last Saturday, a week ago. 1,400 people butchered, murdered brutally. And everyone understands that Israel has a right to defend itself, but the manner in which it prosecutes that defense is really important, because the dominant power, in this case Israel, can do a lot more harm to its own cause than the terrorist Hamas can do to Israel. That is the danger for Israel.
I mean, Sonia, perhaps part of the reason for this, the cancellation of the summit in Jordan, just reading through the wires now, the UN envoy for Palestine, standing alongside other Arab envoys, say that they are outraged by, in quotes, the massacre that has taken place at the Al Ali hospital, and that the finger of blame is very definitely, from his perspective at least, and being pointed in the direction of the Israelis. I mean, it seems unlikely to me we're going to get a definitive answer on this anytime soon. And absent a definitive answer, both sides are going to continue going the way that they have been for the past week.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think what's happened at that hospital tonight, it's absolutely dreadful. So reports are of up to 500 people dead. One of the things we know about hospitals in Gaza is not only, are they home to the sick who couldn't move after that evacuation order from Israel, but it's also where civilians who couldn't move go to shelter. So there would have been lots of women and children outside. So, I mean, it's a sort of unthinkable number of tragedies. But yeah, it's very hard to know, isn't it, following the story tonight, who actually is responsible, with both sides blaming each other. I think what is certain, though, is, well, whoever did it, it obviously is in breach of international law. You're not allowed to target humanitarian sites like hospitals like this. I think everyone's very clear on that. But also the timing of it. President Biden was coming to Israel. He's meeting with Netanyahu. Then there was supposed to be this summit in Jordan. Top of President Biden's mind will be two things. First of all, trying to urge caution with Israel in order to sort of minimise that humanitarian catastrophe that Ali's just been talking about, but also really trying to avoid further escalation. Is ridiculous that may sound, given how escalated it is already, but trying to keep, for example, Iran out of this conflict, Hezbollah. So, I think it's very bad news, because it's going to make those conversations that Biden wanted to have that much harder.
Absolutely.
Still, at every point in this conflict, we have had representatives of Israel Defence Forces saying there are going to be civilian casualties as a result of this. This evening, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conkus, the international spokesman for the IDF, told CNN, "We did not strike that hospital. We do not intentionally strike any sensitive facilities, and definitely not hospitals. We are very much aware of the presence of civilians." And I suppose that it doesn't matter which side you put yourself on. I find it personally difficult to square that circle. The IDF saying there are going to be civilian casualties, and then at the same time suggesting that, do you know what, we don't target civilian facilities. And we have seen housing blocks coming.
But this is a war.
Yeah.
Wars are brutal, and innocent people get killed. And people were killed in Israel. Now innocent Palestinian civilians are being killed who have nothing to do with Hamas at all. Hamas is actually using them as human shields. And the reality is that Israel is going to have to go in on the ground, because there are tunnels, there's a network of tunnels, the most extensive probably in the world, that they have to deal with. And they're also now facing a diplomatic crisis. This whole thing that Sonia just talked about, the summit in Amman has been called off. You've had Mahmoud Abbas walking out of this. You've got demonstrations now happening in the West Bank. You've also got demonstrations happening even in Amman. You've also got Hezbollah having skirmishes with Israel on the northern border, and Iran saber-rattling around this. This is a very, very dangerous situation we are in. And we need to try and calm tempers. And Israel also needs to think about this. The manner in which it prosecutes its war is very important, and also it needs to think about what comes after decapitating Hamas in terms of political settlement. Let's not forget, in Afghanistan, within 2 months, when the Twin Towers came down, the Taliban had been toppled, and 20 years later they're back in power. So you need to think about, as part of decapitation strategy, what comes next.
We just see that Air Force One is moving, but actually, that will probably take more than a couple of minutes to get up into the air. So what I want to do, because this story is everywhere, and personally, it does feel that this may well be a turning point. Yes. Let's just quickly run through the front pages that we have, and we start with the FT. It, of course, leading with what they say is an Israeli airstrike on a hospital in Gaza, reported to have killed hundreds of people. We do not have that confirmed. The attack also the lead for the eye, but instead what they do is they report Israel's denial that the strike was their doing. The Palestinian president, of course, having already declared 3 days of national mourning. The Guardian, and this is the one that I think got me this evening, leading with one of the many harrowing images from the aftermath of the attack. It also adds that Israeli intelligence claims the blast was the result of a failed Hamas rocket launch. The Mail also leading on the attack, which, if the figures are correct, is now the single biggest loss of life in the conflict. Here's the Express. Guess what's on that front page? Yeah, as you'll see in just a second. Yeah, hundreds die at that Gaza hospital. Meanwhile, the Telegraph pointing out that the president's visit to Israel may now come at the most dangerous point of the conflict. Rishi Sunak also set to land in the region later this week. And here is also the Metro. It's echoing the words of a mother whose 21-year-old daughter was taken hostage by Hamas. The headline there, "Bring my baby home." And the Sun reacts to the death of a 13-year-old British girl who's now been confirmed to have died following a Hamas attack in southern Israel. Just a reminder, you can scan the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme and check out the front pages whilst watching us. Well, we'll just continue to keep an eye on what is happening, guys, at Andrews Joint Base, I should say, these days. But whatever results from this, it just feels, and we've seen demonstrations across the region, which will continue no matter what the result of the IDF investigation is. We have seen leaders in the region making clear that this is not the point for jaw, which is scary enough. I mean, what's your view, Sonia? I mean, it does feel that this could really, really cause things to spiral even further out of control very, very quickly.
I think that's right, and I think that's what everybody's so worried about in the region, but also looking, on the outside into the region, which is that it really feels like we're at the brink of a further escalation here that could draw in other states, like Iran, for example. I think if Iran got involved, that would be dreadful news, because you've got the US talking about potential strikes if Iran were to get drawn in. So it could be a big further escalation of this conflict. And I think, hindsight is a fine thing, isn't it? But there are lots of people saying that actually what's unfolded in the Middle East, over the last kind of 10 days or so, isn't that big a surprise to sort of close watchers and close analysts, and that actually, you've seen a real hardening of leaderships on both sides of this conflict. You've got the far-right government of Benjamin Netanyahu. You've got, Hamas, a terrorist organisation, controlling Gaza. But the West sides have sort of been turned away, and you haven't seen the kind of leadership from the US on this that you might expect. And actually, there were people who said that this was sort of a conflict zone that was waiting to blow up. So it's good that people are focused on this now. It's good that this is clearly at the top of Biden's to-do list. But, I think there'll be a lot of people who say, well, this is too little, too late.
I think that's a really interesting point that Sonia raised there about the fact that the US took its eye off the ball on the Middle East. Now, 100%. Clearly the pivot has been to focus on the Asia-Pacific, particularly the threat from China. And what's happening at the moment today, there's a Belt and Road Forum going on with President Xi and Vladimir Putin meeting. So that's been their focus. You can't ignore the Middle East. And this has come back and smacked everyone in the face.
So what hope then, Ali, of...
Well, it's good that Biden's...
The reason I say that, we've been hearing again from the Foreign Secretary, as you would assume at a time like this, the destruction of the Al Ahli Hospital is a devastating loss of human life. But perhaps even the more interesting bit, the UK will work with our allies to find out what has happened and protect innocent civilians in Gaza. I mean, if people are not going to listen to Israel on this, are they going to listen to the Americans? Are they going to listen to us?
There could be an investigation, but the people on the ground will have already made up their minds. You can tell whatever narrative you want. and it may be the Israelis were not involved in this at all, but it will make a blind bit of difference to the people on the ground who are caught up in a war and innocent civilians are dying. So the reality is that Biden has to go there now, and he has to go and have a conversation with Benjamin Netanyahu, but he's not going to be speaking to the Arab leaders in the region. And there's also another problem here, which is there's a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding here, where Egypt will not open its borders, understandably. It does not want to have militants on its own soil, nor will Jordan. And Jordan came out, I mean, King Abdullah was in Germany saying we are not going to have any refugees in our country.
The latest that we are just hearing is the White House has just confirmed that after consulting with the King of Jordan, the President will not be making that visit to Jordan itself, as you might expect. And, you know, the one thing that none of us have mentioned so far in this, and you can understand why there has been the focus in the hospital. And again, that Guardian front page, which we will bring up in just a second once Joe Biden actually takes off, sums up the problem here. You know, non-combatants, kids are being killed. But what of the 200 Israelis that remain in Hamas?
Well, that's the thing,
and that is, and who must now be in more danger.
And on a couple of the front pages, you know, and I think it's really important that we see photographs of what's going on in Gaza. But a couple of the front pages have also got pictures of there were British Israeli hostages, and we know there was a 13-year-old teenage girl who is now confirmed to be dead. Her 16-year-old sister is missing, presumed to be a hostage of Hamas. So it's really, Israel is still counting its dead from that brutal, barbaric terrorist attack that we saw last Saturday, and and this is the issue. So absolutely everything has to be done within humanitarian international law when it comes to war. But I think the real difficulty about this for everyone is that. You need to... Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt, but we have had, as we often get when wheels are up, a statement from the White House. White House officials saying this: after consulting with King Abdullah of Jordan and in light of the days of mourning announced by President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, President Biden will postpone his travel to Jordan and the planned meeting with these two leaders and President Sisi of Egypt. The President sent his deepest condolences for the innocent lives lost in the hospital explosion in Gaza and wished a speedy recovery to the wounded. He looks forward to consulting in person with these leaders soon and agreed to remain regularly and directly engaged with each of them over the coming days. Ali, Sonia, we will have to just pause there. We will have much more, of course, on this story. But first, we're just going to have a very quick look at the weather.